My twin brother called me crying from a payphone in the freezing rain. When I discovered his wife had controlled and humiliated him for 20 years, I did not just get angry. I switched places with him. I stepped into his personal hell and taught her a lesson she will never, ever forget. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled her perfect life, tell me what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that abusers eventually pick the wrong victim. The rain was coming down in relentless, freezing sheets when my truck tires finally crushed the gravel of the downtown bus terminal parking lot. It was 2 in the morning. The neon sign above the diner next door buzzed with a sick yellow light, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. I threw the truck into park and stepped out into the downpour, my eyes scanning the desolate platforms. The smell of exhaust and stale tobacco hung heavy in the damp air. I had not spoken to my identical twin brother Gabriel in 5 years. His wife Valerie had seen to that. She had systematically isolated him, changed his phone numbers, and poisoned the family well, until I was nothing but a toxic memory in their affluent suburban household. But an hour ago my phone had rung. It was an unknown number, a kind stranger at a gas station who had let a shivering old man use their cell phone. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, choking on tears, begging for help. I found him huddled on a wooden bench near the farthest terminal. He was 69 years old, just like me, but the man sitting under the flickering fluorescent light looked a decade older. He was swimming in a thin, soaked windbreaker that offered absolutely no protection against the biting cold. His silver hair, usually so neatly kept, was plastered to his forehead. He was shaking violently, his knees pulled up to his chest, in a posture of complete defeat. I walked up to him slowly, not wanting to startle him. When he looked up, the sheer terror in his eyes made my stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. I sat down next to him and put my heavy wool coat over his trembling shoulders. He flinched at my touch before recognizing my face. He grabbed my arm with terrifying strength, his fingers digging into my jacket. He could barely breathe. He was in the middle of a massive panic attack, his chest heaving as he tried to pull air into his lungs. I asked him what happened. I asked him where his car was. I asked him why he was miles away from his gated community in the middle of the night. The story spilled out of him in fractured, humiliating pieces. He had gone to the grocery store that morning to prepare for Valerie's Sunday country club brunch. He had purchased the wrong brand of coffee. He bought a medium roast instead of her preferred imported dark roast. For this unforgivable crime, Valerie had cornered him in the kitchen. She screamed at him until he backed into the counter. Then, as a punishment, she reached into his pockets and confiscated his wallet, his car keys, his cell phone, and his daily medication pillbox. She told him he was a useless, senile old man who needed to learn how to follow simple instructions. She locked him out of the main house and told him to walk to the store and fix his mistake, or he would not be allowed back inside. With no money and a failing heart, he had wandered into the city, completely lost and terrified, his blood pressure soaring until he collapsed near the bus terminal. Listening to his voice break as he recounted this absurdity, a deep, dangerous quiet settled over my mind. For 20 years, I had worked as a forensic auditor. I spent my career dismantling corporate frauds, tracing hidden assets, and destroying arrogant executives who thought they were untouchable. I dealt in cold, hard facts. But the frail, broken man beside me was not a case file. He was my flesh and blood. I gathered him up, practically carrying him to the passenger seat of my truck. The drive back to my cabin in the woods was silent, save for the sound of the heater working overtime and the rhythmic, terrifying wheeze of his breathing. When we finally arrived at my quiet, secure cabin, the true danger of the situation became apparent. The warmth of the fire did not stop his shaking. His face was flushed with a dangerous mottled red, and he kept pressing his hand against his chest. His blood pressure was spiking to critical levels. He desperately needed his medication, the specific beta blockers Valerie had locked away in her pristine kitchen. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the emergency 24-hour pharmacy in his neighborhood, explaining the situation and asking for an emergency short-term refill. The pharmacist was sympathetic, but completely unhelpful. He pulled up Gabriel's file and informed me that a strict lock had been placed on the account. Valerie had legally established herself as Gabriel's absolute medical proxy. No prescriptions could be authorized, refilled, or released without her direct verbal consent or physical presence. She had built a fortress around his health, turning his very survival into a tool for absolute control. The pharmacist told me I had to call her. I hung up the phone. I looked at Gabriel, who was now lying on my couch, his eyes squeezed shut in pain. I knew that if I called Valerie, she would use this as proof of his incompetence. She would demand he beg. She would likely use the hospital visit to further her narrative that he was losing his mind. I could not let that happen. I walked into my bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead light. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. We were identical twins. Time had aged us similarly, though my face lacked the deep stress-carved lines of constant fear. We had the same build, the same eyes, the same voice. I made a decision that would change the course of all our lives. I walked back into the living room. I reached into the pocket of Gabriel's soaked windbreaker and pulled out the single spare house key he kept hidden on a chain around his neck. I put on his damp, pathetic jacket. I told him to rest, that he was safe and that I was going to get his medicine. I did not tell him how. I drove through the heavy rain toward the affluent suburb of Oak Creek. The sprawling manicured lawns and massive colonial homes looked like fortresses in the dark. I pulled my truck into the alley behind his street and walked the rest of the way. I approached the massive mahogany front door of Gabriel's house. I slipped the spare key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. My intention was simple. I was going to slip inside, find the pillbox in the kitchen, and vanish into the night before anyone knew I was there. I stepped into the grand marble foyer. The house was completely silent, smelling faintly of expensive vanilla candles and lemon polish. I moved silently toward the kitchen, my eyes adjusting to the dark. I was halfway down the grand hallway when the lights suddenly snapped on, blinding me for a split second. Valerie stepped out from the shadows of the formal dining room. She was wearing a silk robe holding a glass of white wine. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She did not see Gideon, the retired auditor, who could destroy her life with a laptop. She saw Gabriel, the broken husband, returning from his punishment. She did not even ask where I had been. She closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. Before I could speak, she slammed a thick stack of past due notices and credit card bills directly into my chest, forcing me to catch them or let them scatter on the floor. "Look at you," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You look like a stray dog begging for scraps. Do you have the right coffee, or are you completely useless?" I stood frozen. I felt the physical force of her anger, the absolute lack of basic human empathy. She poked me hard in the shoulder with her manicured finger. "I am done playing games with you, Gabriel," she continued, stepping into my personal space. "The lease on my luxury SUV is due on Tuesday. You are going to sign over your entire pension check tomorrow morning, or I swear to you I will call the facility and tell them your dementia has made you a danger to yourself. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life eating applesauce in a locked ward. Do you understand me?" She was threatening him with institutionalization over a car payment. She had weaponized his age, his health, and his mind. The sheer audacity of her cruelty sent a shockwave of cold rage through my veins. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stand up straight. I wanted to look her in the eye, introduce myself, and promise her legal annihilation. I wanted to see the terror on her face when she realized she had just assaulted the wrong twin. But I stopped. The forensic auditor in me took over. If I blew my cover now, I would only get Gabriel his pills. Valerie would still hold the medical proxy. She would still hold the house, the bank accounts, and the legal power to destroy him the moment I left. She had spent 2 decades building this prison. A momentary victory would not save my brother. To truly free him, I had to tear the prison down from the inside. I needed evidence. I needed access. I needed time. I looked down at the bills in my hands. I felt the wet fabric of Gabriel's coat clinging to my arms. I took a deep, slow breath, suppressing a lifetime of pride and confidence. I physically adjusted my posture. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, collapsing my chest. I lowered my chin, breaking eye contact and staring submissively at the marble floor. I let my hands tremble slightly, mimicking the exhaustion I had seen in my brother just an hour ago. I embraced the humiliation. I let the silence stretch for a moment, absorbing the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the house. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, perfectly matching Gabriel's defeated tone, I gave her exactly what she wanted. "Yes, Valerie," I whispered. "I understand." She scoffed a short, ugly sound of victory. She turned her back on me, taking a sip of her wine as she walked toward the grand staircase. "Your pills are on the kitchen island," she threw over her shoulder without looking back. "Sleep in the guest room. I do not want you coughing near me tonight." I watched her ascend the stairs, her shadow stretching long against the wall. The trap was set. She thought she had broken her husband completely. She had no idea that she had just invited her absolute ruin through the front door. The switch was complete. Tomorrow, the silent adjustment would begin. I woke up the next morning to the sharp sound of heels clicking across the hardwood floor above my head. The guest room was freezing. There was no heating vent open, and the thin blanket provided absolutely no warmth against the morning chill. I lay there for a moment, staring at the sterile white ceiling. My back ached from the terrible mattress, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the house. I had spent my entire life building a career on logic and financial independence. Now I was waking up in a prison designed specifically to break a human spirit. I forced myself out of bed. I remembered to slump my shoulders and drag my feet, slightly mimicking the heavy, exhausted gait of my brother. I walked out of the room and down the long hallway toward the kitchen. Valerie was already there. She was dressed impeccably, in a tailored suit, drinking a cup of the dark roast coffee Gabriel had failed to buy the day before. She did not say good morning. She did not even look up from her tablet when I entered the room. Instead, she simply tapped a manicured fingernail against a piece of yellow notebook paper resting on the marble island. She told me my list of tasks for the day was written down and that she expected every single item completed before she returned from her country club luncheon. I walked over and picked up the paper. The list was not a set of household chores. It was a calculated exercise in humiliation. She wanted the baseboards in the entire downstairs area scrubbed by hand with a toothbrush. She wanted the grout in the master bathroom bleached. She wanted her massive collection of designer shoes taken out of their boxes, polished, and put back. These were not tasks for a husband. These were tasks designed to keep a man on his knees. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward. I walked over to the refrigerator to get something to eat. Before my hand even touched the handle, her voice cracked through the air like a whip. She told me my breakfast was already on the counter. I looked over and saw a single piece of dry toast and a small plastic cup of generic brand applesauce. She told me my cholesterol was too high and that she would not have me dropping dead and ruining her schedule. She was starving him. She was controlling his calorie intake under the guise of medical concern. I took the dry toast and sat at the small table in the corner of the kitchen. I ate it in complete silence. Once she finished her coffee, she stood up, grabbed her designer handbag, and walked toward the door. Just before she left, she reached into her purse and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. She threw it on the counter. She told me that was my allowance for the week. She told me I needed to walk to the pharmacy later and buy her a specific brand of imported bath salts, and that I better bring back the exact change. A single $20 bill. I stared at the green paper resting on the cold marble. My brother had worked as a senior structural engineer for 40 years. He had built a massive retirement fund. He had paid off the mortgage on this very house 10 years ago. Yet here he was, expected to survive an entire week on $20 in a neighborhood where a simple sandwich cost 15. This was not just control. This was financial starvation. She was reducing a brilliant, hard-working man to the status of a dependent child begging for lunch money. I waited until I heard the heavy front door slam shut and the sound of her luxury car pulling out of the driveway. Only then did I stand up straight. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the satisfying crack of my joints. The act was paused. The forensic auditor took over. I walked into the living room and found Gabriel's cell phone sitting on the entry table. She must have dumped it out of her purse when she returned last night. I picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen lit up, but it immediately asked for a passcode. I knew Gabriel's habits. He always used the year our mother was born. I typed in the 4 digits, and the phone unlocked. I did not immediately check his messages or his contacts. In my line of work, you always look for the invisible strings first. I went straight to the system settings and checked the battery usage and data permissions. I was looking for anomalies. I found one almost immediately. There was a hidden application running continuously in the background, draining a massive amount of battery. The app had no icon on the home screen. It was buried deep within the operating system files. I recognized the software instantly from my corporate fraud investigations. It was a high-level enterprise tracking application, usually sold to paranoid executives to monitor their employees. Valerie had installed military-grade spyware on her husband's phone. It was not just a simple location tracker. This software gave her complete administrative control over the device. It tracked his exact GPS coordinates down to the square foot. It recorded every single text message he sent or received, even if he deleted them. It logged the phone numbers of every incoming and outgoing call. It even had a feature that allowed her to remotely activate the microphone and listen to his conversations without the screen ever turning on. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Gabriel had been carrying around a digital ankle monitor for years without ever knowing it. Every time he went to the store, every time he sat in the park, every time he tried to call a friend, she knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. This explained how she was able to isolate him so completely. If he ever reached out to an old colleague or a family member, she would know instantly and punish him for it. She had built an invisible electric fence around his entire life. Over the next 48 hours, I survived her regime by becoming a ghost. I scrubbed her baseboards. I polished her shoes. I ate the miserable portions of food she allowed me. I endured her constant verbal belittling without showing a single flash of anger or defiance. I let her believe she was still firmly in control of her broken husband. But beneath the pathetic exterior, my mind was working with absolute precision. I mapped out the entire power structure of the house. I learned her schedule. I noted the times she checked her phone and the times she met with her friends. I used those small windows of freedom to explore the rest of the house, looking for locked drawers and hidden documents. I did not touch anything. I did not move a single piece of paper out of place. I simply observed and cataloged. The tracking app on the phone meant I could not make any outside calls yet. I had to leave the device sitting on the kitchen counter whenever I moved around the house so she would think I was simply sitting quietly in one place. By the end of the second day, the picture was completely clear. Valerie was not just a cruel wife. She was a warden, and this house was a maximum security facility built on the foundation of my brother's stolen wealth. She had stripped away his dignity, his resources, and his privacy. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had assumed that her victim was completely alone. She had no idea that the man sweeping her floors was methodically gathering the precise coordinates to launch a devastating legal strike against her. The 48 hours of silent survival were over. It was time to start breaking her empire apart. I was on my knees scrubbing the grout around the outdoor swimming pool when the roar of a sports car engine shattered the quiet afternoon. I did not look up immediately. I kept my head down, scrubbing the white tiles with the stiff, bristled brush Valerie had left out for me. The heavy wooden side gate swung open, and I heard the distinct sound of expensive leather shoes slapping against the concrete patio. It was Justin and his younger sister Heather, my niece and nephew. I had not seen them since they were teenagers, but the spoiled, arrogant expressions on their adult faces were unmistakable. Justin threw his keys onto a glass patio table with a loud clatter. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my brother was allowed to spend on groceries in a year. Heather followed close behind him, scrolling through her phone. She did not even acknowledge my presence. She just walked over to the shaded lounge chair and sat down, complaining about the heat. Justin walked right up to the edge of the pool, stopping just inches from my hands. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply dropped a thick manila folder onto the wet concrete right next to my bucket of bleach water. "Get up," he ordered, his voice tight with impatience. "I need this signed today." I slowly pushed myself off the ground, letting my knees pop loudly. I wiped my hands on the oversized, ragged t-shirt Valerie had given me to wear. I picked up the folder and opened it. My eyes scanned the documents. It was a commercial real estate loan application. Justin was trying to buy a failing boutique fitness center downtown. He was asking for a massive line of credit. But the section that made my blood run cold was the guarantor page. He was using the equity in this very house as collateral. He was risking the roof over his father's head to fund a vanity business project. I looked at the numbers. It was a terrible deal. Any first-year accounting student could see the business was hemorrhaging money. The interest rate on the loan was predatory. "I cannot sign this," I whispered, perfectly imitating Gabriel's hesitant tone. "The risk is too high. If the business fails, the bank will take the house." Justin laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. He stepped closer, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You are not a financial advisor, old man. You are barely capable of buying the right groceries. The deal is already done. The broker just needs your signature to release the funds." Heather finally looked up from her phone. Her voice was dripping with condescension. "Just sign the stupid paper, Dad. Justin is actually trying to build something with his life, unlike you. You just sit around here all day draining Mom's resources. It is the least you can do to pay us back for putting up with your memory lapses." The sheer entitlement was breathtaking. They were treating their father like an ATM machine that was malfunctioning. I kept my eyes focused on the concrete, maintaining my submissive posture. I tried to hand the folder back to Justin. I shook my head slowly. "I cannot do it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It is everything I have left." Justin snatched the folder out of my hand, his face flushing with sudden rage. He grabbed the collar of my t-shirt, yanking me forward. For a split second, my instincts flared. I wanted to drop him right there on the patio. I knew exactly how to break his grip and put him on the ground, but I forced my muscles to go limp. I let him push me back against the cold brick wall of the house. Before he could speak, the sliding glass door opened. Valerie stepped out onto the patio. She was holding a glass of iced tea. She looked at the scene unfolding by the pool and sighed as if she were dealing with unruly toddlers. "What is the problem now?" she asked, her tone bored and irritated. Justin let go of my shirt and turned to his mother. "He will not sign the guarantor forms. He is being stubborn again. He thinks he understands the market." "So?" Valerie walked over slowly. She did not look at her son. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were completely void of warmth. She stepped so close I could smell the expensive perfume she wore. "Gabriel," she said softly, her voice laced with a terrifying calm. "We have discussed this. Justin is expanding his portfolio. You are going to support your family." I looked down at my wet shoes. "The house, it is too much money," I muttered. Valerie took a slow sip of her iced tea. She reached out and patted my cheek. It was a patronizing, humiliating gesture. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered. You will take that pen from your son, and you will sign every single page he tells you to sign. If you do not sign it by dinner time, I will turn off the electricity to the guest room. I will lock the kitchen cabinets, and I will throw your remaining medication down the garbage disposal. You will sit in the dark, and you will starve until you remember who is in charge of your life. Do we understand each other? She was perfectly willing to let her husband suffer a medical emergency to secure a risky loan for her spoiled son. She had normalized this abuse to the point where her children openly participated in it. They were a pack of parasites feeding off the man who had given them everything. I looked at Justin. He was holding out a sleek silver pen, a smug smile plastered across his face. I looked at Heather, who was already back to scrolling on her phone, completely indifferent to the threat her mother had just made. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the folder from Justin. I took the silver pen. "Good," Valerie said, turning her back on me. "Finish scrubbing the pool deck before you come inside. You are tracking dirt everywhere." She walked back into the house. Justin and Heather followed her, leaving me alone on the patio. I stood there holding the commercial loan application. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied a broken old man into handing over the last piece of his financial security. They did not realize they had just given a master forensic auditor the exact documentation he needed. To verify a loan of this magnitude, the bank required full access to all associated financial records, including the shadow accounts I suspected Valerie was hiding. Justin had just handed me the key to the castle. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to go down. I put the folder on the patio table and picked up my scrub brush. The silent adjustment was moving into its next phase. Tonight, I would find every single secret they had buried. I waited in the freezing guest room until the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed 2 in the morning. The house was completely silent. I lay perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning system. I needed to be absolutely certain Valerie and her children were fast asleep. I slowly pulled the thin blanket back and stepped onto the cold, hardwood floor. I took Gabriel's cell phone, the one with the military-grade tracking software, and placed it carefully on the nightstand right next to the bed. If Valerie woke up and checked her tablet, the GPS would tell her exactly what she wanted to see. It would show her broken husband sleeping exactly where he was supposed to be. I slipped out of the room and moved silently down the long, dark corridor. My bare feet made no sound against the thick, expensive carpet of the upstairs landing. I bypassed the master bedroom where I could hear the faint sound of Valerie breathing heavily in her sleep. I continued past Justin's room and Heather's room, descending the grand curved staircase. My destination was the closed mahogany door at the end of the formal dining room, Valerie's private home office. I reached the door and wrapped my hand around the brass knob. I turned it slowly. It was locked. Of course it was locked. She controlled everything in this house, including the flow of information. But a standard interior privacy lock was an insult to a man who had spent his entire career bypassing corporate security systems. I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out a small, rigid piece of plastic I had cut from the edge of a laundry detergent bottle earlier that afternoon. I slid the plastic into the doorframe, manipulating the slanted latch. In less than 10 seconds, the lock clicked open with a soft mechanical snap. I stepped inside and closed the door securely behind me. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. I walked over to the massive oak desk and sat down in her high-backed leather executive chair. The sleek desktop computer sat in the center of the desk, waiting. I reached out and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, casting a pale blue light across the dark room. The login screen appeared, demanding a password. This was the first real test. In my decades of forensic accounting, I had learned one universal truth about arrogant people. They never believe anyone is smart enough to catch them, so their security is always built on vanity. Valerie thought Gabriel was a senile old man who could barely operate a television remote. She would not bother with complex encryption or randomized alphanumeric codes. I looked at the password field. I typed in her own name followed by the year she was born. Incorrect. I typed in the name of her country club. Incorrect. I stopped and thought about what mattered most to her. I thought about the luxury car she had threatened me over the day before. I typed in the make and model of the car, followed by a $sign. The screen flashed green and the desktop materialized. I went straight to work. I did not bother looking at her personal emails or her social media accounts. I cared only about the numbers. I opened her primary document folders and began my audit. What I found over the next 2 hours made my stomach turn. Valerie was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. She was a greedy opportunist who had been operating with absolute impunity for years. She had not even bothered to hide the evidence deeply. She simply relied on the fact that Gabriel was too intimidated to ever look. I opened the bank statements first. Gabriel had worked as a senior structural engineer. He had a massive pension and a substantial retirement fund, but the accounts tied to his name were practically empty. I traced the outgoing wire transfers. Every month, the moment his pension was deposited, Valerie would electronically sweep 95% of the funds into a separate private account, registered entirely in her name. She left him just enough to cover the utility bills, creating a paper trail that made it look like he was paying for the household expenses. But that was just the beginning. I dug deeper into the tax returns and discovered a massive withdrawal from his primary retirement account. It had happened 3 years ago, right around the time his health began to decline. I followed the routing numbers. The money had not gone into their joint savings. It had been funneled into a newly registered limited liability company, a shadow corporation called Apex Holdings. I pulled up the state registry records for the company. The sole proprietors listed on the incorporation documents were Valerie and her son Justin. They had literally stolen his life savings to create a slush fund for themselves. I looked at the expense reports for the shadow company. The money Gabriel had bled for the money he had saved to ensure his family would be safe in their old age was being used to pay for Justin's failed business ventures, Heather's luxury vacations, and Valerie's endless country club fees. They were bleeding him dry while simultaneously treating him like a parasite. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair staring at the glowing monitor. The sheer scale of the financial abuse was staggering. They had taken his past, his present, and his future. And earlier today, they had demanded he sign over the very house he built to secure another terrible loan. I realized then that the loan was not just about buying a fitness center. It was the final phase of their plan. They were trying to extract the absolute last drop of equity from his name before they locked him away in a facility. I pulled a small pen and a piece of scrap paper from the desk drawer. I carefully wrote down every single routing number, every account balance, and the official registration details for the Shadow Corporation. I memorized the passwords she had saved in her browser for the private banking portals. I was gathering the ammunition required to absolutely obliterate her financial existence. I had everything I needed to initiate the freeze, but I could not do it from her computer. I needed my own secure line. I needed to contact the outside world. I neatly folded the piece of paper and slipped it into my pocket. I closed all the document windows, clearing the recent file's history so she would never know anyone had been inside the machine. I shut down the computer, watching the screen fade to black. I stood up and walked back to the door, wiping down the desk and the chair with the sleeve of my shirt to ensure I left no trace. I slipped out of the office and gently pulled the mahogany door shut, making sure the lock engaged with a soft click. I crept back up the stairs, my mind racing with cold, calculated fury. The 48 hours of silent survival had paid off. I knew exactly where the money was, and I knew exactly who had taken it. I returned to the freezing guest room and climbed back into the terrible bed. I picked up the cell phone from the nightstand, confirming the tracking app still showed me safely asleep. Tomorrow I would have to sign Justin's loan documents to maintain my cover. But tomorrow I would also find a way to escape the invisible electric fence and make the phone call that would start the legal avalanche. The midnight audit was complete. The counter-offensive was about to begin. Before I left Valerie's office that night, I noticed one final folder buried deep in her hard drive. It was labeled simply as medical transition. My fingers hovered over the mouse for a fraction of a second before I clicked it open. What I read inside chilled me to the absolute bone. It was not just the financial ruin I had uncovered with the Shadow Corporation. This was the blueprint for my brother's physical imprisonment. Valerie had already paid a private attorney to draft a full declaration of mental incompetency. The document was completely filled out, citing Gabriel's supposed memory lapses, his confusion, and his inability to manage his own affairs. It included a pre-approved admission form for a high-security psychiatric care facility located 3 states away. She was not just going to take his money. She was going to erase him from society entirely so he could never tell anyone what she had done. The paperwork was dated for the end of the month. I had less than 2 weeks before she executed the final phase of her plan. I closed the files and crept back to my freezing bed. The rest of the night passed in a blur of cold calculation. When the sun finally rose, I put on the same ragged clothes she had laid out for me. I walked downstairs to the kitchen. Justin was already there, leaning against the marble counter. He was dressed in a sharp business suit, holding his car keys in one hand and the thick commercial loan application in the other. He looked exactly like a predator, waiting for his trapped prey to finally give up. Valerie was sitting at the breakfast table, casually flipping through a fashion magazine while she sipped her imported coffee. Justin slapped the folder onto the counter as soon as I walked into the room. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply pointed to the bottom of the page where a small yellow sticky note indicated the signature line. "Sign it," he demanded, his voice echoing in the large kitchen. "The broker is waiting for the scan, and I am not going to lose this property because you want to be stubborn." I kept my head down. I let my hands shake just enough to make it look authentic. I looked over at Valerie, hoping to play the part of a desperate husband seeking mercy from his wife. "Valerie," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please. If his gym fails, the bank will take the house. Where will we live?" Valerie did not even look up from her magazine. She slowly turned a glossy page. "You will live wherever I decide you live," she replied coldly. "But if you do not sign that paper right now, you will not be living here by this afternoon. I will make the call, Gabriel. Do not test me." She was referring to the incompetency papers I had just found on her computer. She was actively threatening to have him committed if he did not hand over the equity to her son. The sheer evil of the threat was staggering, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. It confirmed that she was fully committed to her own destruction. I turned back to Justin. He thrust a heavy silver pen toward my chest. I reached out with a trembling hand and took it. I pulled the document closer to me. The paper was crisp and official. It was a legally binding contract that would attach hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to my brother's name. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line. I took a short, shallow breath. For 20 years, Gabriel had signed his name to checks, to mortgages, to birthday cards for ungrateful children. But the man holding the pen right now was not Gabriel. We were identical twins. We shared the same face, the same voice, and the same DNA, but our legal identities were entirely separate. Our signatures were vastly different. Gabriel's handwriting was rounded and precise, reflecting his career as an engineer. My signature was a sharp, aggressive scrawl born from decades of signing audit reports and legal affidavits. I did not try to forge my brother's name. I did not write a shaky version of Gabriel. With fluid, deliberate strokes, I signed my own legal name. Gideon. I looped the letters perfectly, pressing hard enough to leave a deep indentation on the paper. I signed the main guarantor page. I flipped to the second page and signed my name again. I initialed the liability waiver with my own initials. To an arrogant, impatient kid like Justin, an old man's cursive was just a blur of ink. He was not looking at the spelling. He was only looking for the surrender. He was only looking for the ink on the line so he could get his money. I put the pen down and pushed the folder back across the counter. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, maintaining the illusion of absolute defeat. Justin snatched the folder up immediately. He flipped through the pages, quickly checking that all the sticky notes had been covered. A massive, triumphant smile spread across his face. He looked at me with pure disgust. "See how easy that is," he sneered. "If you just did what you were told, your life would be a lot less miserable." He closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. He kissed his mother on the cheek, thanking her before walking out the door to drive to the bank. Valerie finally looked up from her magazine. She gave me a cold, approving nod, as if I were a dog who had finally learned to sit on command. She told me to go clean the garage. I turned around and walked away. A deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest. Justin was driving to a major commercial bank with a fraudulent document. He was about to submit a high-stakes loan application using a guarantor signature that did not match the name on the account, the deed to the house, or the biometric records at the financial institution. The document was completely void. But more importantly, the moment the bank processors ran that signature through their fraud department, they would flag the transaction. Justin had just handed the bank documented proof of attempted mortgage fraud. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had secured their wealth. They had absolutely no idea that I had just lit the fuse on a legal bomb that was going to level their entire world. I walked into the garage and picked up a broom. I had successfully survived the morning. Now I needed to find a way to leave the house without triggering the tracking app so I could make the phone call to my lawyer. The net was tightening, and Valerie was completely blind to it. Valerie cornered me in the hallway just before noon. She shoved a crumpled grocery list into my chest along with a $10 bill. She told me I needed to walk to the plaza 2 miles away and buy her specific brand of sparkling water. She warned me not to take too long because she would be actively checking my location on her phone. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust, reminding me to use the service entrance when I returned so I would not track dirt onto her foyer rug. This was the exact opportunity I had been waiting for. I put on Gabriel's worn-out sneakers and walked out the front door. I felt the weight of my own leather wallet hidden deep inside the lining of my jacket. I had kept my own cash and my own identification cards when I made the switch at the cabin. Valerie had stripped Gabriel of all his financial power, but she had absolutely no idea she was living with a man who had immediate access to limitless resources. I walked the 2 miles to the shopping plaza, keeping my head down and my pace painfully slow. My mind was rapidly calculating the exact radius and limitations of the tracking software on Gabriel's phone. The application was highly accurate, but it had a margin of error of about 50 feet depending on the structural interference of large concrete buildings. I needed a location that would mask my movements perfectly without triggering a stationary alert on her end. I entered the massive grocery store. The building was a sprawling concrete box with a reinforced steel roof. I knew this would scramble the tracking signal just enough to cause a slight drift on Valerie's screen, making it look like I was simply walking down the aisles. I walked directly to the pharmacy section located at the very back of the massive store. I approached the drop-off window and set Gabriel's phone down on the glass counter, making sure the screen was facing up. I told the pharmacist I needed to check my blood pressure on the public machine just a few feet away. I asked him if he could watch my phone for a moment so it would not get stolen from the basket. The pharmacist nodded kindly and turned his back to fill a prescription. The moment he looked away, I did not go to the blood pressure machine. I turned and walked quickly down the paper goods aisle, slipping through the employee-only swinging doors at the back of the store. I navigated the narrow concrete hallway and pushed open the heavy metal exit door leading to the outdoor loading dock. I had exactly 12 minutes before the tracking app registered my phone sitting completely idle for too long and alerted Valerie. I sprinted across the loading dock, ignoring the sharp pain in my knees. I ran down the alleyway, separating the grocery store from a rundown strip mall. I walked into a small electronics shop that smelled like stale smoke and cheap plastic. I pulled $100 bill from my hidden wallet and purchased a prepaid cellular device. I did not wait for the clerk to offer a receipt or his change. I tore the plastic packaging open as I walked back out into the alleyway, leaving the box in a dumpster. I powered the device on. My hands were perfectly steady. I dialed a number I had memorized 15 years ago. It was the direct private line of Wallace, a ruthless corporate attorney, and my former legal partner. We had spent decades tearing down fraudulent empires together. He was a man who traded in secrets and absolute destruction. He picked up on the second ring. I did not say hello. I told him it was Gideon. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He asked me where I had been and why I was calling from an unregistered prepaid number. I told him I did not have time to explain the entire situation, but that I was currently standing in a dirty alleyway wearing my brother's clothes because his wife was trying to systematically destroy him. I rattled off the information I had stolen from Valerie's computer the night before. I gave Wallace the exact routing numbers for the shadow corporation called Apex Holdings. I gave him the names of the banks, the offshore accounts, and the dates of the largest wire transfers. I told him about the commercial real estate loan Justin was attempting to secure using a forged signature. Finally, I told him about the medical incompetency papers Valerie was planning to file by the end of the month to lock Gabriel in a psychiatric facility forever. Wallace listened in complete silence. When I finished speaking, his voice was ice cold. He told me he understood exactly what needed to be done. I gave him my strict instructions. He was to contact his highest-level associates at the private wealth management firm holding the Apex accounts. He was to initiate a stealth freeze on all assets tied to Valerie and Justin immediately. I told him to use his legal authority to flag the accounts for suspected elder financial abuse and wire fraud, but to do it quietly. I wanted the bank to simply decline their transactions without giving them an official reason yet. I wanted Valerie to feel the sudden, terrifying panic of losing control before the actual legal hammer dropped on her head. Wallace agreed completely. He told me the stealth freeze would be active in less than 24 hours. He asked if I needed him to send the police to the house right now to pull me out of the hostile environment. I told him absolutely not. I told him if we moved too fast, Valerie might find a way to destroy the remaining physical evidence or spin the narrative to make Gabriel look crazy to the authorities. I had to stay inside the house and play the broken husband until the trap was completely sealed and inescapable. We agreed to communicate only once a day on this prepaid phone. I ended the call and slipped the burner phone deep into my heavy work boot. I checked my watch. 9 minutes had passed. I ran back up the alleyway, slipped through the metal loading dock doors, and navigated the employee hallway back into the grocery store. My chest was heaving and my lungs burned, but I forced myself to slow down to a pathetic, exhausted shuffle as I pushed back through the swinging doors into the public aisles. I walked back to the pharmacy counter. The pharmacist was still busy typing on his computer. Gabriel's phone was sitting exactly where I had left it, on the glass counter. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. The tracking application showed my location as a static blue dot right inside the pharmacy. Valerie had not noticed a single thing. The illusion of my complete submission was still perfectly intact. I took the crumpled $10 bill Valerie had given me and walked over to the beverage aisle. I bought her exact brand of imported sparkling water, making sure to get the receipt with the exact change. I walked the 2 miles back to the house in the freezing afternoon air. The physical toll on my aging body was incredibly heavy, but my mind was completely alive and focused. For 20 years, Valerie had controlled every single aspect of my brother's existence. She thought she was the untouchable architect of his demise. She did not know that the blueprint had just been stolen and the demolition crew had already been dispatched. I opened the front door of the massive colonial home. Valerie was sitting in the living room watching a television show about luxury real estate. I walked over and placed the sparkling water on the glass coffee table along with the receipt, and her remaining coins. She did not look at me. She just waved her hand in the air, dismissing me to the kitchen. I walked away, keeping my head down. My boot felt incredibly heavy with the secret device hidden inside. The silent adjustment was no longer just a plan in my head. It was an active legal operation. Tomorrow morning, when she tried to spend Gabriel's stolen money, she was going to hit a massive invisible brick wall, and I was going to be standing right next to her, watching her entire world begin to shatter. I was summoned to the master bedroom precisely at 6 in the evening. Valerie had laid out a charcoal suit on the edge of the bed. It was 2 sizes too big. She did not care how it fit. She only cared that I wore it to her dinner party tonight. I put the suit on, letting the fabric swallow my frame to enhance the illusion of a shrinking, frail old man. I retrieved the burner phone from my work boot and slipped it deep into the interior breast pocket of the jacket. I walked downstairs where Valerie was waiting by the front door, wearing a stunning emerald evening gown and a necklace I knew my brother had purchased for her 10th anniversary. She looked me up and down and adjusted my tie with a sharp, aggressive tug that felt more like a leash than a loving gesture. She drove us to a massive estate located on the highest hill in Oak Creek. The driveway was lined with luxury vehicles. We were attending a private dinner party hosted by the board members of her country club. As we walked up the stone steps, she leaned in close and whispered her instructions directly into my ear. She told me to speak only when spoken to. She told me to agree with everything she said, and most importantly, she told me not to embarrass her by dropping my food or forgetting the names of her important friends. We entered the grand dining room. The table was set for 12 people with heavy crystal glasses and silver cutlery. The room buzzed with the shallow, arrogant conversation of the local elite. Valerie immediately guided me to a chair at the far end of the table, isolating me from the center of attention. She took her seat right in the middle, holding court like a queen. Throughout the first course of the meal, she completely ignored me. But as the wine began to flow and the main course was served, she seamlessly shifted the conversation to the topic of her own manufactured suffering. She sighed loudly, placing her silver fork down on her expensive china plate. She looked around the table, ensuring she had the absolute attention of every single guest. She began to weave a terrifyingly convincing story about her tragic life as a caregiver. She told them about the incident 2 days ago, when Gabriel had wandered away from the grocery store. But she did not tell them she had confiscated his wallet and locked him out of his own house. She told them he had suffered a severe manic episode and forgotten his own name. She told them she had spent hours driving through the dangerous parts of the city, crying hysterically, until she finally found him sitting on a curb, completely detached from reality. The guests gasped in synchronized sympathy. The woman sitting next to Valerie reached out and placed a comforting hand on her arm, praising her for her incredible strength and dedication. A wealthy real estate developer sitting across from me slowly shook his head and offered me a look of profound pity. I sat there chewing a piece of dry chicken, listening to my own wife publicly assassinate my brother's character. She was laying the psychological groundwork for the incompetency papers. She needed these powerful people to witness his supposed decline so that when she finally locked him in a psychiatric ward next week, no one would question her motives. They would all nod their heads and agree that it was the most compassionate choice for a man who had lost his mind. I lowered my head, staring blankly at my plate. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, playing the part of a man entirely disconnected from the conversation around him. I let them bathe in their false pity, but beneath the heavy tablecloth my hands were moving with calculated precision. I reached into my breast pocket and retrieved the small plastic burner phone. I kept my hands resting quietly on my lap, hidden by the thick linen napkin. I had spent my entire career typing complex mathematical formulas on physical keypads without ever needing to look at the keys. I navigated the tactile buttons of the cheap phone entirely by touch. I opened a new text message addressed to Wallace. I began to type the routing numbers for the Shadow Corporation Apex Holdings. I typed the 9-digit bank codes, the account numbers, and the exact dates of the fraudulent wire transfers I had memorized during my midnight audit. Every time Valerie paused her tragic monologue to take a sip of wine, I pressed the send button, transmitting another piece of the puzzle to my lawyer. Valerie continued her performance, completely unaware of the digital execution taking place right under her nose. She looked down the table directly at me. She asked me in a loud, condescending voice if I remembered the name of the man sitting next to me. The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes locked onto me, waiting to see the broken man fail. I looked at the man. I knew exactly who he was. He was the chief financial officer of a local medical supply company. But I did not say that. I blinked my eyes rapidly, letting a look of panic wash over my face. I opened my mouth but made no sound. I looked back at Valerie, pretending to be lost and terrified. Valerie offered the table a sad, brave smile. She told them not to worry. She told them these lapses were happening more and more often, and that she was consulting with specialists to find the best permanent care facility for my condition. The guests murmured their support, completely validating her wicked plan. Under the table, my thumb pressed the final button. The last message was sent. I felt a single short vibration against my leg. It was Wallace confirming receipt of the data. The message was simple. He told me the stealth freeze on all of Valerie's accounts would be officially activated at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I picked up my water glass with a trembling hand and took a slow sip. Valerie was basking in the glow of her friend's admiration. She thought she had just successfully secured the social approval she needed to throw her husband away. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy convincing the room that I was a mindless fool, I had just handed over the exact financial coordinates needed to destroy her empire. The dinner party dragged on for another hour, but my work was done. Tomorrow she would wake up expecting to finalize her purchase of the Aspen vacation home using Gabriel's stolen money. Tomorrow, the silent adjustment would violently breach the surface of her perfect reality. I was wiping down the vast granite countertops in the kitchen when Valerie floated down the grand staircase. She was wearing a flowing silk robe and a triumphant smile that stretched from ear to ear. She carried a thick folder of closing documents and a glossy brochure featuring a massive snow-covered cabin. Today was the day she was going to finalize the purchase of her Aspen vacation home. She was going to use the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had systematically siphoned from my brother's retirement accounts to buy a luxury winter playground for herself and her entitled children. She spread the paperwork across the kitchen island, humming a cheerful tune. She did not even acknowledge my presence as I stood just a few feet away, holding a damp rag. To her, I was simply part of the kitchen appliances, a broken machine that no longer served a purpose other than basic maintenance. I kept my head down and continued to wipe the pristine counter, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I knew that exactly at 8 o'clock this morning, Wallace had executed the stealth freeze on every single account tied to the Shadow Corporation. I glanced at the digital clock on the microwave. It was 9:15. The trap was already armed and waiting. Valerie opened her sleek silver laptop and booted it up. She poured herself a glass of fresh orange juice and sat down on the high leather stool. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers dance across the keyboard as she logged into the private banking portal. This was the exact portal I had compromised during my midnight audit. She navigated to the wire transfer page. She typed in the massive sum required for the real estate closing. She did not hesitate. She felt absolutely no guilt about stealing a lifetime's worth of hard-earned money from the man she had sworn to love and protect. She reached over and firmly clicked the enter key to authorize the transaction. A heavy, pregnant silence filled the large room. Valerie frowned. She leaned closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing. She tapped the trackpad again. The bright red error message must have been glaring back at her. Transaction declined. She let out a small, annoyed sigh, attributing it to a simple computer glitch. She refreshed the page and entered the routing numbers a second time, pressing the keys with a bit more force. She clicked, authorize. Again, the system denied her. Her cheerful demeanor instantly evaporated. The muscles in her jaw tightened. She picked up her cell phone and dialed the direct line to her private wealth management firm. Her voice was initially sweet and polite, dripping with the fake charm she reserved for anyone she considered useful to her goals. She asked to speak with her senior account manager. She playfully complained that the online banking system was being difficult and requested that he manually push the wire transfer through immediately because her real estate broker was waiting for the funds. I kept scrubbing the same spot on the granite, listening intently to the one-sided conversation. The voice on the other end of the line must have delivered the devastating news with absolute bureaucratic coldness. Valerie's face drained of all color. The fake sweet tone vanished entirely, replaced by a shrill, terrifying shriek. She demanded to know what he meant by administrative hold. She stood up from the stool, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She screamed that she was the primary account holder of Apex Holdings and that she demanded access to her liquid capital this very second. The bank manager, acting on the strict legal instructions Wallace had filed, gave her no concrete answers. He simply stated that the accounts were under emergency review by the fraud department and that all outgoing transfers were strictly and permanently prohibited until the investigation concluded. He refused to give her a timeline, and he refused to transfer her to a supervisor. He simply advised her to wait for official correspondence in the mail. Valerie dropped the phone from her ear. She stared blindly at the wall for a full 10 seconds, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Her perfect, untouchable reality was suddenly dissolving, and she had absolutely no idea who was pulling the strings. The panic set in. It was a feral, destructive panic. She slammed the laptop shut with so much force that the silver casing cracked straight down the middle. She picked up her heavy glass of orange juice and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the stainless steel refrigerator, sending sticky liquid and sharp shards raining across the floor. She turned to me. Her eyes were completely unhinged, wild, with the terrifying realization that she was losing control. She needed a target for her rage, and I was the only one in the room. She marched over to me and snatched the damp rag right out of my hand, throwing it onto the floor. She screamed that I was a curse on her life. She screamed that my pathetic existence was a dark cloud that was ruining everything she had built. She completely ignored the fact that everything she had built was entirely funded by my brother's money. I shrank back against the wooden cabinets, raising my hands defensively. I lowered my head and let a look of absolute terror wash over my face, playing the part of the battered husband flawlessly. I whispered a frantic apology, begging her to calm down. But inside my chest, my heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm of absolute victory. The invisible brick wall had been hit, and the impact was catastrophic. The financial starvation she had inflicted on Gabriel for 20 years was suddenly her own immediate reality. She paced back and forth across the kitchen, stepping on the broken glass without even realizing it. She muttered to herself, trying to calculate her next move. Without that money, she would lose the Aspen house. But worse, without those accounts, she could not pay the massive credit card bills she had racked up this month. The illusion of her wealth was entirely dependent on the continuous theft of my brother's pension, and now the pipeline was sealed shut. She stopped pacing and looked at me again. The panic in her eyes slowly hardened into something much more dangerous. It was pure, cold desperation. She realized that the only remaining asset she had not fully liquidated was the equity in this very house. And to get that, she needed Gabriel entirely out of the picture. The blocked transfer had not stopped her greed. It had simply accelerated her timeline. The final confrontation was coming much faster than I had anticipated. I remained on my hands and knees, carefully picking up the shattered pieces of the heavy glass from the sticky kitchen floor. Valerie had retreated to the formal living room. Her feral screaming had stopped, replaced by a terrifying and focused silence. I could hear the rapid tapping of her fingernails against the glass coffee table. She was trying to rationalize the blocked transfer. In her deeply narcissistic mind, the idea that she had been caught or outsmarted was a mathematical impossibility. She firmly believed she was the smartest person in any room she entered. Therefore, the bank issue had to be a temporary administrative error. It had to be a glitch caused by the massive size of the wire transfer. She picked up her phone and dialed Justin's number. I kept my head down, scrubbing the floor, but I listened to every single word. She did not ask him if he was busy. She ordered him to cancel his afternoon meetings and come to the house immediately. She told him it was an absolute emergency regarding his inheritance. Justin arrived 20 minutes later. The heavy front door slammed shut, and his expensive leather shoes echoed across the marble foyer. He walked into the living room demanding to know why she had summoned him like a child. Valerie did not raise her voice. She spoke in low, urgent tones outlining the failure at the bank. Justin instantly panicked. His entire demeanor shifted from arrogant entitlement to desperate fear. He paced across the Persian rug, running his hands through his hair. He complained that the broker for his commercial gym loan was demanding proof of collateral by the end of the week. He whined that if the liquid cash in the shadow accounts was frozen, they had absolutely no way to cover their massive credit card debts or secure his business venture. He told his mother they were entirely exposed. Valerie snapped at him to stop acting like a coward. She told him the bank hold was just a minor setback, an annoying bureaucratic hurdle that would clear in a few days. But she agreed that it highlighted a critical vulnerability in their plan. They were currently relying on liquid cash that was technically tied to a corporate entity under review. They needed an untraceable, bulletproof asset. They needed the physical equity of the house. She told Justin they could no longer afford to wait until the end of the month to execute the medical transition. The timeline was too risky. She walked over to the large calendar hanging in the hallway. She tapped her manicured finger against the square for the upcoming Friday. It was only 3 days away. She declared that Gabriel would be legally erased by Friday evening. She laid out the new accelerated plan with chilling precision. She was going to call her private attorney and have him bring the finalized power of attorney and medical proxy documents directly to the house. They were going to corner her husband in the study. They would force him to sign the papers turning over absolute legal control of the estate and giving her the power to make all medical decisions on his behalf. Justin stopped pacing. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He asked his mother what they would do if the old man refused to sign. Valerie looked toward the kitchen where she knew I was working. Her voice was loud enough for me to hear every single syllable clearly. She said she would break him completely. She promised Justin that if Gabriel resisted, she would lock him in the upstairs study without food, without water, and without his blood pressure medication until he begged for the pen. She said that the moment the ink was dry on the documents, she would call the private psychiatric transport team she had already put on retainer. They would arrive in an unmarked van, strap him to a gurney, and take him to the locked ward of a facility 3 states away. He would never step foot inside this house again. I knelt on the floor, holding a damp rag soaked in orange juice. The sharp edges of a missed glass shard bit into my palm, but I barely registered the pain. My window of operation had just slammed violently shut. I no longer had 2 weeks to carefully build an airtight legal case with Wallace. I had exactly 3 days before a team of orderlies arrived to physically drag me out of the house. If the transport team arrived, I could simply drop the act. I could stand up, show them my real identification, and prove I was Gideon, not Gabriel. The orderlies would leave, but that would ruin the final execution of the trap. Valerie would immediately realize she had been tricked. She would hire expensive defense lawyers, claim it was a terrible misunderstanding, and spend years dragging the fraud case through the courts. I could not let that happen. I needed her to commit the ultimate crime in front of undeniable witnesses. I needed her to step into a trap so tightly wound that the moment it snapped shut, her entire life would be severed. I threw the broken glass into the garbage bin and washed my hands at the sink. I dried them on a towel and walked out to the living room carrying a silver tray with a fresh cup of coffee. I played the part of the obedient, beaten servant to absolute perfection. I kept my shoulders slumped and my eyes fixed on the floor. Valerie took the cup from the tray without even offering a glance in my direction. She was already holding her phone, dialing her private attorney to book the signing appointment. Justin walked past me, heading for the front door. He intentionally dropped his shoulder and bumped hard against my chest, knocking me off balance. I stumbled backward, clutching the silver tray. He laughed, a short, ugly sound of pure malice. He told me I should probably go pack a small bag because I was going on a very long, permanent vacation soon. I caught my balance and offered a weak, pathetic nod. Let them gloat. Let them believe the absolute victory was theirs. They were completely blinded by their own greed, accelerating their own demise. Later that afternoon, when Valerie went upstairs to change her clothes, I retrieved the burner phone from my heavy work boot. I sat in the dark closet of the guest room and sent a rapid text message to Wallace. I told him the deadline had moved to Friday. I told him Valerie was bringing her attorney to the house to force the signature on the power of attorney documents. Wallace replied less than a minute later. His message was simple and incredibly dangerous. He told me to let them bring the papers. He told me to sign whatever they put in front of me, ensuring I used my own legal signature just as I had done with the loan. He said the final trap was already set at the bank. The moment she walked into that financial institution and tried to execute those forged documents, she would cross the legal point of no return. The ultimatum had been issued, but she had absolutely no idea she was giving it to the wrong man. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating heaviness. The sky outside was a flat, bruised gray, matching the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. I had spent the last 48 hours playing the part of a terrified ghost, scrubbing floors and eating table scraps while Valerie and Justin frantically scrambled to secure their crumbling financial empire. They thought they were running out of time because of a banking error. They had absolutely no idea that the clock ticking down was actually attached to a legal explosive I had planted. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. I was in the living room polishing the silver tea set when Valerie rushed down the stairs. She was dressed in a sharp black business suit, looking entirely too formal for a Friday morning at home. She did not even look at me as she opened the door. A tall, thin man walked into the foyer carrying a thick leather briefcase. He wore a gray suit and a perfectly forced smile. Valerie greeted him warmly, referring to him as Mr. Sullivan. I recognized his type immediately. In my decades of forensic auditing, I had crossed paths with hundreds of lawyers just like him. They were the expensive fixers who operated in the gray areas of the law, shielding the wealthy from the consequences of their own greed. Sullivan was not here to protect my brother. He was here to legally sanitize his destruction. Valerie gestured for him to follow her toward the back of the house. Justin emerged from the kitchen, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and joined the procession. They walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private study. Valerie stopped and turned around. She pointed her finger at me, ordering me to get up and follow them. I placed the silver polishing cloth on the coffee table. I let my shoulders slump forward and dragged my feet as I walked toward the hallway. Justin stood by the open door of the study, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and eager anticipation. As I crossed the threshold, he stepped into the room behind me and pushed the heavy mahogany door shut. The thick wood completely muffled the sounds of the outside world. I heard the distinct metallic click of the brass lock engaging. They had literally locked me inside the room. There were no windows facing the street, only a single large pane of glass looking out over the enclosed backyard. It was a perfectly designed interrogation box. Sullivan walked over to the massive mahogany desk and placed his leather briefcase on the polished surface. He popped the brass latches open and began pulling out stacks of thick legal documents. He arranged them in perfect, precise piles. He did not look at me. He treated me as if I were a piece of defective machinery that simply needed to be decommissioned. Valerie walked around the desk and stood right next to the lawyer. She placed her hands flat on the wood, leaning forward to establish her absolute dominance in the room. She told me to sit down in the heavy leather chair opposite the desk. I obeyed, keeping my eyes cast downward. I let my hands tremble, visibly resting them on my knees. Valerie did not waste time with pleasantries. She told me the game was officially over. She pointed to the thickest stack of papers on the desk. She announced that those were the permanent medical proxy and absolute power of attorney documents. She said they gave her complete unhindered control over every single financial asset, property deed, and medical decision associated with my name. I looked up at her, letting my eyes widen with manufactured terror. I whispered that I did not want to sign them. I pleaded with her, telling her I was perfectly fine and that I could manage my own affairs. It was the exact response she wanted. It fueled her sadistic need for control. She smiled a cold, reptilian smile. She walked around the desk and stood directly over me. She lowered her voice to a chilling whisper. She told me that I did not have a choice. She pointed a manicured finger toward the thick velvet curtains covering the side window. She told me that parked just 3 blocks away was an unmarked white van carrying 2 private psychiatric orderlies. She claimed she had already paid them a massive cash retainer. She explained in excruciating detail that if I refused to pick up the pen and sign every single page, she would make a single phone call. The orderlies would walk through the front door, strap me to a medical gurney, and inject me with a heavy chemical sedative. I would wake up in a locked ward located in a different state with no phone, no money, and no legal rights. She promised me I would die in that facility surrounded by strangers who thought I was completely insane. Justin laughed from the corner of the room. He told me to just listen to his mother and make it easy on myself. He said I was too old to fight back anyway. Sullivan, the lawyer, finally spoke up. He adjusted his expensive tie and offered me a look of deep, patronizing sympathy. He told me that his client was only acting in my absolute best interest. He said my cognitive decline was becoming a burden on the family and that these documents were simply a standard legal precaution to ensure I received the proper care. He was actively participating in a hostage situation and wrapping it in the language of legal compassion. I sat in the chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their evil. They had cornered an elderly man in a locked room, threatening him with physical abduction and permanent chemical imprisonment if he did not hand over his entire net worth. If Gabriel were sitting in this chair, he would have been completely broken by now. He would have signed away his life just to avoid the terrifying van waiting down the street. The psychological torture was absolute. But I was not Gabriel. I was Gideon. My heart was not hammering with fear. It was beating with the cold, steady rhythm of an executioner about to drop the blade. Every single threat Valerie made, every single word Sullivan spoke was just another nail in their legal coffin. They were committing criminal extortion, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud right in front of my eyes. I kept my head down, hiding the dangerous intensity in my eyes. I let out a soft, pathetic sob, mimicking a man whose spirit had finally snapped. I slowly reached my trembling hand toward the desk. The climax of the silent adjustment had arrived. I was ready to sign my name and destroy them all. I let my hand hover over the thick silver pen resting on the mahogany desk. I kept my breathing shallow and erratic, mimicking a man on the verge of a total nervous collapse. I looked up at Sullivan, the private attorney, with tears perfectly pooled in my eyes. I asked him if I could at least read what I was signing before I gave my entire life away. Valerie immediately slammed her hand flat against the desk. She leaned in and told me there was nothing to read. She said I was wasting her time and that the orderlies in the white van were getting impatient. But Sullivan held up a single manicured finger to stop her. He was a professional parasite, and he knew the rules of the game. He calmly explained to Valerie that for the documents to hold up in probate court, the subject needed to appear to have reviewed them voluntarily. He pushed the heavy stack of papers toward me and told me to take a few minutes. I slowly pulled the documents closer. I wiped my eyes with the back of my trembling hand and began to read. To the untrained eye, the pages were just a dense wall of complex legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. But to a retired forensic auditor, they were as clear as glass. I scanned the clauses and the stipulations. The cruelty embedded in these pages was absolutely breathtaking. It was not just a standard power of attorney. Sullivan had drafted a complete and total surrender of human agency. The financial section gave Valerie immediate and irrevocable access to all bank accounts, real estate deeds, and life insurance policies. It explicitly waived my right to an independent financial audit. It gave her the power to sell the very house we were sitting in and keep 100% of the proceeds without any legal obligation to provide for my future care. But the medical proxy was far worse. I turned to the second section of the thick packet. My blood ran completely cold. Valerie had not just given herself the power to institutionalize me. She had included a clause that granted her absolute authority over my end-of-life care, including a strict "do not resuscitate" order. If Gabriel ever had a major medical emergency in that psychiatric facility, Valerie had legally mandated that the doctors let him die. She was signing his death warrant and forcing him to endorse it. She wanted the money, and she wanted the man who earned it to disappear permanently. I felt a surge of pure, violent anger welling up in my chest. I wanted to reach across the desk and wrap my hands around Sullivan's expensive silk tie. I wanted to destroy the room. Instead, I let out a loud, pathetic sob. I let my shoulders shake violently, burying my face in my hands. I wept for the 20 years of silent torture my brother had endured. I wept for the absolute betrayal by the woman who was supposed to be his partner. Justin scoffed loudly from the corner of the room. He called me a pathetic old coward and told me to hurry up because he had places to be. Valerie tapped her foot impatiently against the hardwood floor. She told me to stop the theatrical crying. She reminded me about the van waiting just 3 blocks away. She told me the sedative they used was incredibly painful, and that I would wake up in a room with padded walls. I slowly lifted my head. I looked Valerie directly in the eyes. I let her see the absolute defeat she craved. I whispered that I would do whatever she wanted. I picked up the heavy silver pen. It felt cold and solid in my grip. I turned to the first signature line on the financial surrender document. I did not hesitate. I pressed the tip of the pen against the paper and signed my legal name. Gideon. I used the sharp, aggressive loops that I had used to sign hundreds of corporate indictments throughout my career. I flipped to the second page and signed my name again. I turned to the medical proxy and signed my name right below the "do not resuscitate" order. I initialed every single page exactly where Sullivan had placed a small yellow sticky note. I was legally endorsing documents with a signature that did not match the name on the account, the biometric records at the bank, or the marital certificate. I was handing them a stack of worthless forged paper. I placed the pen back on the desk. I pushed the papers away from me and slumped back into the heavy leather chair. Valerie snatched the documents up instantly. She practically ripped them off the desk in her eagerness. She flipped through the pages, checking every single signature line with hungry, desperate eyes. She did not read the cursive letters. She only saw the blue ink that represented her absolute victory. A massive, genuine smile broke across her face. It was the first time I had seen her look truly happy since I arrived. She turned to Sullivan and handed him his copy of the paperwork. She thanked him for his excellent service and told him his retainer bonus would be wired by the end of the day. Justin walked over and clapped his mother on the shoulder. He looked at me with a smirk of absolute victory. He told me I made the right choice. Valerie did not even bother to look at me again. I was no longer a person to her. I was just a cleared obstacle. She turned her back on me and walked toward the heavy oak door. Justin and Sullivan followed her out. The door clicked shut behind them, but this time I did not hear the brass lock engage. I was no longer a prisoner. I was just a ghost waiting to be evicted. I sat alone in the quiet study listening to their cheerful voices echoing down the hallway. They thought they had just secured millions of dollars and a permanent life of luxury. They had absolutely no idea that the ink drying on those pages was the exact evidence Wallace needed to trigger federal fraud charges. The trap was fully armed. Valerie was about to walk into the bank and detonate her entire life. I listened to the sound of Valerie's luxury sports utility vehicle tearing out of the driveway. She was speeding toward the downtown financial district, with the forged documents sitting on her passenger seat. She firmly believed she was driving toward her ultimate financial liberation. I walked out of the locked study and went straight to the kitchen. I did not go back to scrubbing floors. I retrieved my burner phone from my boot and dialed Wallace. He answered immediately. He told me his associate, the senior branch manager at the private wealth institution, was already waiting for her. Wallace had arranged a secure conference line to monitor the meeting, ensuring we had a flawless audio record of her attempting to commit federal fraud. He patched me into the feed. I stood in the center of the silent kitchen, listening through the small speaker of the plastic phone. I could hear the faint ambient noise of the bank lobby. Then I heard the unmistakable sharp click of Valerie's high heels echoing against the polished marble floor. She did not wait in line. She marched directly past the velvet ropes and demanded immediate entry into the senior manager's private glass office. She announced herself with the aggressive entitlement of a woman who believed she owned the building. The manager, a man trained perfectly by Wallace, greeted her with absolute professional coldness. He invited her to sit down. Valerie did not sit. She slapped the thick stack of legal documents directly onto his pristine glass desk. I could hear the heavy thud of the paper through the phone. She demanded that he immediately lift the administrative hold on the Apex Holdings accounts. She instructed him to process the wire transfer for her Aspen vacation home and to liquidate the remaining balance of Gabriel's retirement funds into a separate offshore account registered solely under her name. She told him she now held absolute permanent medical and financial power of attorney. The manager remained perfectly calm. He picked up the documents and began to review them. The silence on the open line was thick and heavy. I pictured Valerie standing there tapping her foot, expecting the terrified compliance she was so used to extracting from my brother. She told the manager to hurry up because her real estate broker was waiting for the confirmation number. The manager finally spoke. His voice was smooth and devastatingly precise. He told her that he could not process the wire transfer to Aspen. He told her he could not lift the administrative hold. Valerie immediately raised her voice. She pointed to the paperwork and screamed that the documents gave her absolute legal authority over every single penny in the trust. The manager corrected her. He told her she was operating under a massive misunderstanding. He explained that the power of attorney document was entirely useless because the accounts she was trying to access no longer existed. He told her that 48 hours ago, the primary account holder had bypassed the Shadow Corporation and executed a total liquidation protocol. Every single dollar from the retirement funds, the investment portfolios, and the offshore accounts had been legally transferred to a secure blind trust located outside of her legal jurisdiction. The Apex Holdings accounts were completely zeroed out and permanently closed. I heard Valerie gasp. It was a sharp, ragged intake of air. The illusion of her endless wealth was instantly vaporized. She stuttered, struggling to form a coherent sentence. She demanded to know how Gabriel could have possibly done that. She screamed that he was a senile old man who did not even know how to use a computer. She slammed her hands against the desk, demanding the manager reverse the transfers immediately. She told him Gabriel was mentally incompetent, and that the power of attorney she just provided proved she was in charge. That was the exact moment the trap snapped completely shut. The manager let her finish her frantic screaming. Then he delivered the final lethal blow. He told her that the documents she brought into his office were legally fraudulent. He explained that the bank utilized highly advanced biometric signature verification for all high net worth clients. He told her the signature on the bottom of the power of attorney did not match the established legal baseline for Gabriel. The cursive loops were wrong. The pressure was wrong. The name itself was entirely inconsistent with their deeply encrypted security files. Valerie fell completely silent. The sheer impossibility of the situation broke her mind. She had watched him sign the papers with her own eyes just an hour ago. She had locked him in a room and forced him to do it. She could not comprehend how the signature was fake. The manager did not give her time to process the mystery. He shifted his tone from customer service to absolute legal authority. He informed her that attempting to execute a forged legal document to seize assets from a closed account was a severe violation of federal banking laws. He told her that presenting fraudulent medical proxy papers to a financial institution constituted aggravated wire fraud and attempted elder financial abuse. I heard the sound of a heavy chair scraping backward. Valerie was panicking. She reached across the desk to grab the documents. She told the manager she was taking her paperwork and leaving. She said she would be contacting her own lawyers to sue the bank for gross negligence. The manager stopped her. His voice was like a steel trap. He told her the documents were now classified as material evidence in an active federal fraud investigation. He refused to hand them back. He informed her that bank security had already locked down the exterior doors and that he was legally obligated to report this entire interaction to the authorities. He told her she was no longer a client of the bank. She was a suspect. Valerie completely lost her mind. She shrieked a guttural sound of pure terror and rage. I heard the sound of her sweeping everything off the manager's desk. Pens, paperweights, and files crashed onto the floor. She screamed that they were all conspiring against her. She screamed that she was going to destroy everyone who stood in her way. Then I heard the heavy footsteps of the bank security officers entering the room. They ordered her to step away from the desk. They escorted her out of the private office while she kicked and screamed like a feral animal trapped in a cage. Wallace muted the audio feed from the bank and came back on the line. He told me the manager had secured the forged documents in the vault. He said Valerie was currently being physically removed from the premises and thrown onto the sidewalk in front of dozens of witnesses. The financial execution was a complete success. She had absolutely nothing left. Her stolen money was gone. Her leverage was gone. Her pristine social reputation was currently bleeding out on the pavement of the financial district. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked around the massive, immaculate kitchen that Valerie had ruled with an iron fist for 2 decades. The silence in the house was no longer oppressive. It felt clean and incredibly light. I took off the ragged, oversized shirt she had forced me to wear and threw it directly into the garbage can. I walked upstairs to the guest room and began packing the small bag Justin had mockingly told me to pack earlier that morning. I was not packing for a psychiatric ward. I was packing the final pieces of physical evidence. Valerie was undoubtedly racing back to the house right now to unleash her fury on the weak, broken man she thought she had trapped. She was coming back to destroy Gabriel. She had absolutely no idea that Gabriel was miles away, resting comfortably in a secure cabin, and that the man waiting for her was the architect of her absolute ruin. Valerie drove home in a blur of manic rage. She gripped the leather steering wheel of her luxury vehicle so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She ran 2 red lights and nearly collided with a delivery truck. Her mind was a chaotic storm of denial and fury. She refused to accept that her weak, pathetic husband had outsmarted her. In her arrogant worldview, Gabriel was nothing more than a broken pack animal. She convinced herself that he had accidentally triggered some automated fraud alert by calling the wrong department, or that some overly ambitious bank clerk had flagged the transaction by mistake. She firmly believed that once she got her hands on him, she could beat the compliance back into him. She planned to drag him back to that bank by his collar and force him to fix whatever mess he had made. She turned into the exclusive gated community, her tires screeching against the pristine asphalt. She pulled into the long, circular driveway and slammed the car into park. She did not even bother to close the car door. She marched up the front steps, her high heels striking the stone like weapons. She threw the heavy mahogany front door open. It crashed violently against the interior wall, sending a shockwave through the silent foyer. She screamed his name. Her voice was guttural and raw, echoing through the massive empty spaces of the house. There was no answer. The house was completely silent. It was not the oppressive, fearful silence she was used to commanding. This was the hollow, chilling silence of absolute abandonment. She marched into the kitchen, expecting to find him cowering in the corner or scrubbing the sink. The kitchen was immaculate, but entirely empty. She stormed down the hallway and threw open the door to the private study. The heavy leather chair sat empty. The desk was completely clear. A new, terrifying thought began to form in the back of her mind. She turned and ran up the grand staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. She rushed down the upstairs corridor and kicked the door to the freezing guest room wide open. The room was perfectly sterile. The terrible thin blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She walked over to the small plastic garbage bin in the corner. Sitting inside the trash were the ragged, oversized clothes she had forced him to wear for the past week. He had stripped off the uniform of his humiliation. Valerie pulled her cell phone from her designer purse. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She opened the military-grade tracking application she had used to monitor his every move for years. The screen loaded, and a bright blue dot appeared. A wave of sick relief washed over her. The blue dot was right here in the house. He had not escaped. He was hiding. She followed the digital map on her screen. It led her back downstairs. She walked slowly into the formal dining room, and then back into the kitchen. The blue dot pulsed directly over the marble island. Valerie walked over and looked down. Gabriel's cell phone was sitting perfectly centered on the cold stone. Right next to the phone was the single crumpled $20 bill she had thrown at him days ago. It was a silent, devastating message. A terrified man running for his life does not leave his only form of communication and his only source of cash behind. Only a man who no longer needed her permission to survive would do that. Valerie stared at the phone. The tracking application, the invisible electric fence she had built around his life, had been nothing but a useless toy. She had been monitoring a ghost. Miles away, I was driving down the interstate in my own heavy-duty truck. I was no longer wearing the pathetic rags of a battered husband. I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit. The fabric felt like armor. Sitting on the passenger seat next to me was a thick leather briefcase. It did not contain forged documents. It contained absolute, undeniable truth. It held the certified bank records, the routing numbers for the Shadow Corporation, and the sworn affidavit from Wallace outlining the exact timeline of the federal wire fraud. I felt a profound sense of calm settling over me. The chaotic survival phase of my infiltration was over. The surgical strike was fully prepared. I knew exactly where Valerie was going to be tonight. Months ago, she had planned a lavish vow renewal ceremony to celebrate her 20th wedding anniversary. It was an incredibly expensive event hosted at her elite country club. She had invited 200 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city. The entire event was designed to showcase her perfect life, her perfect marriage, and her perfect social standing. She had originally planned to use the party as a final victory lap, assuming Gabriel would be safely locked away in a psychiatric facility by the time the champagne was poured. She had intended to play the role of the tragic, brave wife who was soldiering on despite her husband's unfortunate mental decline. Back at the house, Valerie was hyperventilating. She picked up the abandoned cell phone and threw it against the marble backsplash, shattering the screen into 1,000 pieces. She grabbed her own phone and dialed Justin. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety. She told him Gabriel was gone. She told him the house was empty and the tracker was broken. Justin immediately began to panic, asking if they should flee the state before the police arrived. Valerie screamed at him to shut up. She told him they could not run. Running would be an admission of guilt. She looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was 3:00 in the afternoon. The vow renewal ceremony was scheduled to begin at 7. She told Justin they had to attend the party. She explained that if they canceled an event of that magnitude at the absolute last minute, it would trigger massive suspicion among their powerful friends and the country club board members. They had to maintain the illusion of absolute control. They would put on their expensive clothes, they would smile for the photographers, and they would figure out how to hunt Gabriel down tomorrow morning. She hung up the phone and walked toward the master bedroom to prepare for the evening. She thought she was making a brilliant tactical decision to save her social reputation. She had absolutely no idea that she was dressing up for her own execution. She believed Gabriel was wandering the streets, alone and confused. She did not know that the man coming to her party was a master forensic auditor holding the exact coordinates of her destruction. The final battleground was set, and all the players were moving directly into place. The grand ballroom of the Oak Creek Country Club was a masterclass in manufactured elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the 200 guests. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and rare caviar. A live string quartet played softly in the corner, masking the shallow conversations of the local elite. These were the people Valerie had spent 20 years trying to impress. They were powerful politicians, ruthless corporate executives, and wealthy socialites who traded favors and gossip like currency. I stood in the deep shadows near the heavy velvet curtains of the rear entrance, holding my leather briefcase. I was wearing my custom-tailored navy blue suit. The fabric felt completely different from the pathetic, oversized rags I had worn for the past week. I blended in perfectly with the billionaires and the board members. No one paid any attention to the older man standing quietly by the heavy doors. They were all waiting for the guest of honor to arrive. Precisely at 7:00, the massive double doors at the front of the ballroom swung open. Valerie stepped into the room with Justin close behind her. She was wearing a stunning white silk gown, designed specifically for this vow renewal ceremony. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and wrists catching the light from the chandeliers. On the surface, she looked like a flawless high society queen, but my trained eyes could see the absolute panic radiating from her rigid posture. Her smile was incredibly tight and brittle, not reaching her eyes. She scanned the room frantically, searching the faces of the crowd. She was looking for a confused, frail old man in a baggy suit. She was looking for the victim she thought she had permanently broken. As she moved through the room, accepting hollow compliments and fake air kisses, her desperation grew visible. Gabriel was not there. The reality that he had truly vanished was finally sinking in. Justin walked beside her, looking completely terrified, with his eyes darting toward the exits. He knew that without the signed documents and the stolen money, this entire lavish party was a massive unpaid bill they could not afford to settle. The whispers began to ripple through the wealthy crowd. People were noticing the absence of the groom. Valerie felt the social pressure mounting rapidly. She knew she had to control the narrative immediately, before the gossip turned against her and ruined her perfect reputation. She could not let them think her husband had abandoned her or that her marriage was a sham. She had to make them believe he was a tragic, broken man who desperately needed her protection. She abandoned her conversations and marched directly toward the elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. She climbed the carpeted stairs and gestured aggressively for the string quartet to stop playing. The music died instantly, leaving a heavy, uncomfortable silence in its wake. She walked to the center of the stage and pulled the heavy silver microphone from its stand. 200 faces turned to look at her, holding their crystal glasses in quiet anticipation. Valerie looked out over the crowd of elites. She took a deep theatrical breath and let a single perfect tear roll down her powdered cheek. She was a master manipulator executing the performance of her lifetime. She thanked everyone for coming to celebrate their 20th anniversary. Her voice trembled perfectly, echoing through the massive speakers positioned around the room. Then she delivered her fabricated tragedy. She told the crowd that her heart was completely shattered tonight. She told them that her beloved husband Gabriel was missing. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as guests brought their hands to their mouths in shock. She leaned into the microphone, letting her voice crack with fake emotion. She explained that his cognitive decline had accelerated violently over the past 48 hours. She lied with absolute conviction, telling her friends that he had suffered a severe psychotic break this afternoon and wandered away from their home. She painted a picture of a man who no longer recognized his own family, a man who was a profound danger to himself. She told them she had spent the entire day searching the dangerous city streets, crying and praying for his safe return. She was weaponizing their sympathy, using their wealth and influence to validate the forged medical proxy she had tried to execute at the bank earlier that day. She wanted everyone in the room to bear witness to his supposed insanity. She did not stop there. She pointed her finger toward the back of the room where the country club management team was standing in shock. Her tone shifted from a grieving wife to a commanding dictator giving orders. She publicly demanded that the security director lock the main gates of the estate immediately. She ordered them to dispatch every single guard to search the golf course, the gardens, and the dark parking lots. She told the crowd that Gabriel might be hiding on the premises, confused and terrified of the lights and the noise. She instructed her wealthy friends not to approach him if they saw him, but to call the authorities immediately, because his dementia made him incredibly hostile and unpredictable. She was turning a beautiful vow renewal ceremony into a manic public manhunt. She wanted to use the local police and the private security team to capture my brother, drag him back to her, and force him into the locked psychiatric ward she had already paid for. She stood on that stage, bathed in the bright spotlight, completely confident that she had successfully manipulated the entire room into doing her dirty work. She believed she had won the ultimate victory. She had dug her own grave as deep as it could possibly go. I tightened my grip on the leather handle of my briefcase. I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains and began walking slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom. It was time to give her exactly what she asked for. I stepped out from the heavy velvet drapes and walked directly into the center aisle of the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers illuminated my navy blue suit perfectly. My posture was completely straight, my shoulders were squared, and my steps were measured and deliberate. I did not look like a man suffering from a psychotic break. I looked exactly like what I was, a man who had spent 40 years commanding boardrooms and dismantling corporate empires. The wealthy guests standing near the back of the room parted instantly, sensing the sheer gravity of my presence. The whispers died in their throats. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased. As I moved closer to the stage, the silence spread like a wave crashing over the 200 attendees, until the only sound in the massive room was the steady strike of my leather shoes against the polished floor. Valerie was still standing at the microphone, holding a pose of manufactured grief. She saw me approaching, and her entire body locked into a state of absolute paralysis. She gripped the silver microphone stand so tightly, I thought she might snap it in half. Justin noticed me a second later. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child. He took a step backward, bumping into a tall, floral arrangement. I climbed the carpeted stairs to the stage. Valerie opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was trying to compute how the broken old man she had starved and abused was suddenly standing before her, radiating absolute authority. She still thought I was Gabriel. She thought her husband had miraculously found his courage. She reached out a trembling hand, trying to play the part of the concerned wife, but I did not even look at her. I simply reached out and took the microphone from her frozen fingers. She backed away, stumbling slightly in her expensive silk gown. I walked over to the podium, where the audio-visual technician had set up the control board for the evening slideshow. I placed my leather briefcase on the podium, popped the brass latches, and pulled out my sleek silver tablet. I plugged the venue display cable directly into my device. I turned to face the crowd. 200 pairs of eyes stared back at me wide with shock and confusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I spoke with the calm, chilling precision of a forensic auditor, presenting his final report to a grand jury. I thanked Valerie for her incredibly moving speech. I told the room that my dear wife was absolutely correct about one thing. A severe mental breakdown had occurred in our household, but it was not mine. I tapped the screen of my tablet. Instantly, the two massive projection screens flanking the stage lit up. The romantic photographs of their 20-year marriage vanished. In their place, a brilliant high-definition image of a bank statement appeared. The numbers were enormous, stretching across the 20-foot screens. I heard several guests gasp as they recognized the private wealth management logo. I calmly explained what they were looking at. I guided their eyes to the highlighted offshore wire transfers. I introduced the crowd to Apex Holdings, the shadow corporation Valerie and Justin had created. I showed them the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts stolen from a lifetime of hard-earned pension funds. I explained how my loving wife had systematically drained every single account, leaving only enough pennies behind to pay the utility bills. I clicked to the next slide. The screen filled with the itemized expense reports from the shadow company. The entire room watched in absolute horror as the undeniable proof of her greed was laid bare. They saw the receipts for her luxury car leases, her designer clothing, and her incredibly expensive country club membership fees. I pointed out a specific $40,000 withdrawal used to pay for the very party they were currently attending. I told the crowd that the woman standing on this stage weeping for my safety was actually funding her lavish lifestyle with stolen money while feeding her husband dry toast and tap water in his own kitchen. Valerie was shaking violently, her hands covering her mouth. The wealthy socialites she had desperately tried to impress were now staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. I turned my attention to Justin, who was slowly trying to inch his way toward the side exit. I tapped the screen again. The massive projection shifted to the commercial real estate loan application he had demanded I sign just a few days ago. I pointed out the highly leveraged debt he had attempted to attach to the family home. Then I zoomed in on the signature line. I told the room about the terrifying morning when my son and my wife had threatened to turn off the electricity to my room and throw my heart medication down the drain if I refused to sign away the deed to the house. I let that sink in. I let these powerful people imagine the sheer depravity required to extort an elderly man over a business loan. I told them the document was completely void because it was submitted using a fraudulent signature. The final blow had to be absolute. I could feel the energy in the room shifting from shock to profound outrage. I tapped the tablet one last time. The screen flashed and displayed the medical proxy and power of attorney documents Valerie had forced me to sign in the locked study that very morning. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector cooling fans. I read the clauses aloud. I read the section granting her the power to legally lock me in a psychiatric facility without a medical evaluation. Then I read the do not resuscitate order. I looked out at the audience and told them that the woman wearing the white silk gown had legally mandated my death if I ever suffered a medical emergency. She had planned to lock me away, steal the final pennies of my equity, and let me die alone in a padded room. Valerie let out a high-pitched wail, dropping to her knees on the stage. She was completely destroyed. The pristine image she had carefully cultivated for 2 decades was burned to the ground in less than 5 minutes. The politicians, the corporate executives, and the socialites were actively stepping away from the stage, wanting absolutely nothing to do with her. She had tried to weaponize this party to declare her husband legally insane. Instead, she had provided the perfect venue for her own spectacular public execution. I stood there under the bright lights, looking down at her trembling form. She was begging me to stop crying real tears of absolute terror. She still did not understand how her weak husband had managed to compile this massive forensic dossier. She had no idea that the final piece of the trap was waiting right outside the ballroom doors. The massive screens glowed with the absolute proof of their crimes. Justin realized his life was over. The fraudulent loans, the stolen money, the entire illusion of his wealth had just been broadcast to the most powerful people in the city. He snapped. He let out a feral yell and charged the stage. He bounded up the carpeted stairs, aiming directly for me and the tablet resting on the podium. He thought he was attacking his weak, frail father. He thought he could just knock an old man down, smash the digital device, and somehow silence the truth. But I was not a sick, dependent old man. I had spent my life working in hostile environments. As he lunged forward, swinging his fists wildly, I simply pivoted my weight, shifting to the side. I reached out and grabbed his tailored lapel, using his own aggressive momentum against him. I threw him face first onto the hard wooden floor of the stage. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his expensive suit sliding across the polished boards. I placed my heavy leather shoe firmly squarely on the center of his back, pinning him down. He gasped for air, struggling like a caught fish, but he could not move. The wealthy crowd gasped again, stepping even further back from the violence. Valerie screamed her son's name. She was still on her knees, reaching out toward Justin, but she was entirely too paralyzed by shock to actually stand up and help him. Before she could even process the fact that her husband had just effortlessly neutralized a man 30 years younger, the heavy double doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung violently open. The loud crash echoed over the silent crowd. 4 uniformed police officers walked into the room. Their hands rested professionally on their heavy utility belts. They were led by a tall man in a sharp gray suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. It was Wallace, my former legal partner. He surveyed the room with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The sea of politicians and socialites parted for him immediately, creating a wide, clear path leading straight to the stage. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal fraud investigation. But Wallace was not walking alone. Right beside him, walking with a steady, confident stride, was another man. He was wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his face was no longer pale and drawn. The dark circles under his eyes had faded after days of proper rest and critical medical care at my cabin. He did not look like a broken, dependent old man wandering the streets in the rain. He looked dignified and absolute. It was Gabriel, the real Gabriel. The crowd began to murmur in absolute disbelief as he walked down the center aisle. They looked at the man walking next to the police, and then they looked up at the stage where I was still standing, with my foot resting heavily on Justin's back. Valerie slowly turned her head. Her tear-streaked face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at Gabriel approaching the stage, and then she snapped her head back to look at me. Her eyes darted wildly between the two of us. The physical impossibility of the situation tore through her narcissistic mind like a bullet. We were identical twins. We shared the same face, the same build, and the same voice. For a long, terrifying moment, her brain completely short-circuited. She tried to speak, but she only managed a hollow, gasping sound. She looked at my aggressive posture, pinning her son to the floor, and then at Gabriel's calm, peaceful expression. The horrifying realization finally washed over her, completely shattering her reality. The man she had screamed at in the hallway, the man she had starved in the kitchen, the man she had locked in the study and threatened with a psychiatric ward was not her husband. She had invited a complete stranger into her home and handed him the exact tools needed to dismantle her entire existence. Gabriel stopped right at the edge of the stage. He did not look at the massive projection screens displaying his stolen wealth. He only looked at Valerie. For 20 years he had kept his head bowed to avoid her constant wrath. Now he stood incredibly tall. Valerie crawled toward the edge of the stage, reaching her shaking hands out to him. She whispered his name, begging him to tell the police there had been a terrible mistake. She pleaded with him to save her, reminding him that she was his loyal wife. Gabriel looked down at her with absolutely no pity in his eyes. His voice was steady and clear, carrying through the silent ballroom, without the need for a microphone. He told her she stopped being his wife the day she decided his life was a burden. He told her the marriage was completely over, and that she was going to spend a very long time locked in a small room, paying for every single thing she had stolen. I lifted my foot off Justin's back. 2 police officers immediately stepped onto the stage and hauled my nephew to his feet, snapping heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. He did not fight back. He just stared at the floor, completely broken and defeated. I walked to the edge of the stage and stood directly above Valerie. She looked up at me, her eyes completely wide with terror. She finally understood that I was the architect of her destruction, the forensic auditor who had traced every single hidden penny. I looked down at the woman who had spent 2 decades turning my brother's life into a living nightmare. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, devastating finality that I knew would echo in her mind for the rest of her miserable life. "You spent 20 years breaking my brother," I said, my words cutting cleanly through the dead silence of the room. "It only took me 2 weeks to break you." The lead detective stepped forward, moving past me and Gabriel. He did not ask Valerie any questions. He did not need to. Wallace, my former legal partner, handed the detective the thick leather briefcase containing the certified bank records, the forged power of attorney documents, and the time-stamped surveillance photos from the bank lobby. The evidence was absolute and undeniable. The detective looked at Valerie, who was still kneeling on the edge of the stage, her expensive white silk gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. He loudly read her rights, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. He informed her she was being placed under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud forgery and felony elder financial abuse. Valerie shook her head wildly. She looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, the politicians and the socialites she had spent decades cultivating. She begged them to intervene. She cried out to a local judge standing near the back of the room, demanding he stop this outrage. The judge simply turned his back on her and walked out the door. The rest of the elite crowd followed his lead, averting their eyes and murmuring in disgust. In less than 10 minutes, Valerie had gone from the queen of the country club to a total social pariah. 2 female officers approached her. They grabbed her arms and pulled her roughly to her feet. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping around her wrists was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of her invisible electric fence finally being wrapped around her own life. Justin was standing near the edge of the stage, his hands already cuffed behind his back. The arrogant, entitled son, who had shoved me against a brick wall and threatened to starve his own father, was now sobbing uncontrollably. He completely abandoned any sense of loyalty to his mother. He began screaming that the Shadow Corporation was entirely her idea. He yelled that she had forced him to sign the commercial loan documents and that he had nothing to do with stealing the retirement funds. He was willing to throw the woman who raised him directly under the bus to save his own skin. The police officers ignored his pathetic whining and physically marched him toward the rear exit. His fraudulent business ventures, his luxury cars, and his entire financial future had just evaporated. He was going to spend the best years of his life sitting in a federal prison cell. Gabriel walked slowly toward the center of the room where the officers were holding Valerie. The remaining guests parted for him, completely silent, out of profound respect. He did not look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man who had finally woken up from a 20-year nightmare. Valerie saw him approaching, and her survival instincts kicked in one final time. She let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. She told him she was so sorry. She claimed the money did not matter, and that she only wanted to protect their family legacy. She begged Gabriel to tell the police to let her go, promising she would never disrespect him again. Gabriel stopped right in front of her. He did not yell. He did not show an ounce of anger. He looked at her with a chilling calm that terrified her more than any screaming match ever could. He told her she had destroyed their family legacy years ago when she decided his kindness was a weakness to be exploited. He told her she was a parasite and that her host had finally cut her off. He turned his attention to her designer purse resting on a nearby cocktail table. He calmly reached inside, bypassing her expensive cosmetics and her platinum credit cards. He pulled out the heavy brass keyring holding the keys to the massive colonial house he had built with his own 2 hands. He held the keys up, letting the metal jingle softly in the quiet room. He placed them deep inside his own pocket. He looked Valerie directly in the eyes one last time and told her she would never step foot inside his home again. The officers pulled Valerie away. She kicked and screamed, her pristine white gown dragging across the floor as they hauled her out the heavy double doors and into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark country club parking lot, signaling the absolute end of her reign of terror. Gabriel turned around and walked over to me. We stood side by side on the polished hardwood floor, identical twins separated by decades of manipulation, but finally reunited in absolute victory. I placed my hand on his shoulder. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound, unspeakable gratitude. We did not need to say anything else. The silent adjustment was complete. We turned our backs on the ruined stage, the abandoned champagne glasses, and the whispers of the remaining guests. We walked down the center aisle together, pushing through the heavy ballroom doors and stepping out into the cool, crisp night air. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Valerie and Justin were indicted on 17 counts of federal fraud and conspiracy. Because they had utilized interstate banking wires to move the stolen funds, the charges carried mandatory maximum sentences. The Shadow Corporation was completely liquidated by the federal government, and every single stolen penny was carefully traced and returned to Gabriel's secure blind trust. He retained absolute ownership of his home, his pension, and his dignity. Today, Gabriel lives a peaceful, quiet life. He spends his mornings drinking the exact coffee he wants to drink, and his afternoons sitting by the pool without a single person demanding his money or his submission. We talk on the phone every single day. He is healing, and I am incredibly proud of the man he has remembered how to be. Sometimes the only way to defeat a monster is to let them build their own trap and simply hand them the lock. Tell me what you thought of my brother's story in the comments below. Have you ever known someone who pushed a kind person too far and lived to regret it? Let me know what city you are watching from, and please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that justice always finds a way. I will see you in the next story.